have a question for you. If I had a magic pill that would do all of these things, would you want it? Decrease your risk of cancer, ovarian cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer, rectal cancer. Decrease your diabetes risk better than the medications. Decrease your risk of depression. Decrease your risk of obesity. Decrease your risk of high cholesterol, kidney disease, heart disease, stroke, and almost guarantee that you would have a longer and healthier life. It so much sounds like an infomercial, doesn't it? Would you want that magic pill? Of course, most people would say, well, yeah, sure, as long as the side effects aren't horrible, but virtually no negative side effects. And, you know, I would be surprised if Facebook would even let me post something about a pill that was that amazing. But what it actually is low-level physical activity. Hooray. So it's, it's amazing, all those, I have study after study that will show that and more, and yet it's, when we want to have changes like this, we look for a medication, a drug, a treatment, some type of technical thing, instead of just doing what our bodies are meant to do, which is eat right and move more. And so last week we talked about sitting is the new smoking, and this week we're going to continue that theme a little bit. We're going to talk about epigenetics, which sounds maybe difficult to understand or scary, but it's actually a really interesting new area of research and how that affects our bodies. And we're going to talk about 3 studies from the English-speaking world on physical activity and what it shows about improving your lifespan and your health span. So let's jump right in. Epigenetics. What is this epigenetics thing? So we have our genetics, and for decades we've been having this discussion about nature versus nurture. So let's say you have one identical twin that is raised by one group and another identical twin that is raised by another group. We have the exact same genes, but we have 2 different environments. We typically say, well, it's nature versus nurture. What is going to turn these people into who they become? But the lines are being blurred these days. So the epigenetics is all of the things around the gene that can change the way that the gene expresses. So we have a gene, let's say I have blue eyes, and then we have gene expression. What types of food am I getting? What types of toxins am I being exposed to? That might change my eye color in a way. Now, when we're talking about epigenetics of the health benefits of movement, we're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of genes that change positively or negatively based on what we're doing. So if we have those 2 people, it's not just a straight nature versus nurture debate. The environment that that person is in actually has the potential to change how the genes are expressing. And what that means is what traits you actually see. So you might have a family history of diabetes, for instance, or a family history of heart attack risk, or cancer, or stroke. And those genes make you at an increased risk for having those things happen. But if we change the way that we're behaving, that will actually change which genes are expressing and how they're expressing. So there were a couple examples from nature. There was a naturalist, and he was studying these flowers. He was hiking up the mountain, and there were these beautiful flowers on one side of the mountain. And he got up over the top of the other side of the mountain. He said, "This is incredible. All the way up this side, the flowers are one color, and all the way down the other side, they're a different color. These are amazing flowers. They must have differentiated. We must have had some type of advantage that allowed it to be a better flower on that side, that color for whatever reason." And so he thought it was a completely different species that it had evolved. And so he picked some flowers, he brought it back to the lab, and when he checked the genetics of this flower, he found out that it was exactly the same species of flower on one side or the other. So you might say, well, that's just nurture, if you will, but it actually changed the way that the genes expressed. And you could indeed pick a flower from one side, or unplant and dig up, unplant a flower, that's good, and take it to the other side of the mountain, and it would actually change color based on the environment that it's in. And we're no different. We also change based on what's going on around us. So scientists did some studies with rats. They love playing with rats. And what they did is they took some rats and they did what they call hind limb unloading. So they took their back foot and their other back foot, and they basically put a rubber band around it so they can't move. These poor little rats are like pinned down with their back leg. And for 12 hours, they did hind limb unloading. And then they took those things off, and you think, oh, great, they're being nicer to these rats. And then they forced them to do 4 hours of low-intensity physical activity, which they pretty much want to do on their own anyway. So they're just trotting along on their little treadmill, nice and slow, walking, just moving along. So 12 hours of inactivity, followed by 4 hours of low-intensity physical activity. The old model for this would be that as soon as they start doing activity, that's going to turn on all these genes that we get benefits of physical activity, which indeed is what happened. We have these genes that have been down-regulated from sitting too much, essentially, sitting for 12 hours. And as soon as they started moving, that changed. 21 out of the 25 genes that they were studying turned back on. Now, I want you to think of these as light switches. If I had a light switch on this side of the room and a light switch on this side of the room that controlled the same thing, we did some inactivity and we flipped off these switches. And the second we started doing activity, we flipped it back on over here. And so we were able to control that light on both sides of the room. But what if I had some things that were on one wall that weren't on the other wall? That could be problematic. So scientists were also studying 38 other genes that were upregulated by inactivity. In other words, sitting caused certain genes to turn on. Now those genes, you'd think, well, the second we start exercising, they're going to turn off. And they don't. So these genes that turn off with inactivity immediately turn back on with activity. But the genes that turn on with inactivity, the only thing that will turn them off is a long period of activity, or the absence of inactivity, if you will. I know that's a weird thing to think about. In other words, not sitting too much. The absence of inactivity. So 27 out of these 38 switches remained significantly above the control group. In other words, they didn't shut off when we started moving again. So we have genes within us that, or at least these rats, and we're fairly similar, they had genes within them that would turn on by being inactive, by not moving, by just sitting on the floor, that don't turn off until an extended activity, an extended period of activity. So what does this mean for us is that the old model of looking at things like I can just sit all day as long as I exercise once a day, that we talked about last week, 30 minutes a day is the recommended activity levels by the American Heart Association. That's good, but it's not good enough. We also need to look at how long are we sitting at any given time. So there were 3 studies I told you we were going to talk about. The first was a study in the United States. They took over 50,000 men and over almost 70,000 women who were aged 50 to 74, and they just measured their activity levels, and what they found was that women in the highest sitting group, they were sitting for over 6 hours a day, had a 40% higher all-cause mortality rate. In other words, they were more likely to die, they were 40% more likely to die than the people who weren't sitting as much. And the men in the same category, sitting for 6 hours, had a 20% higher all-cause mortality rate. Sitting greater than 6 hours a day, even if you were exercising, it was still a higher risk of death. So we want to move more. Sitting increased the risk of death even in the group that had the highest physical activity. So this is people that like maybe run in the morning, but then sit all day at work, sit all day at driving to and from work, and then sit all day at home, maybe come home and watch some television. So activity, again, didn't turn off those genes. Once you sat for an extended period of time, the only way to shut those genes off was prolonged period of not sitting. Exercise didn't cut it. You had to not sit for a long period. Okay, then we had an Australian study. They studied almost 9,000 people, and with this group, the mortality rate increased by 50%. You're more likely to die with sitting 4 hours a day. Sitting while watching TV was even worse, and they think that was because it came with other habits, such as snacking, which is in and of itself a negative habit. So, other bad habits with TV watching resulted in even worse, but 50% increased risk of death is bad enough on its own. Now, we have a Canadian study, one more. The Canadian study had over 17,000 people, and they watched these people over a course of 12 years. They were studying them, and what they found is a dose response. Now, what a dose response means is, think about if you're taking like a Tylenol or something. If I take a low dose Tylenol, maybe it will take the edge off my pain, but if I take a higher dose Tylenol, it might take away more of my pain. If I take a higher dose, it might take away all my pain. And of course, there's a limit to that threshold, and we don't need to be overdosing on pain medication. But the dose response that they found was the more sitting people did, the earlier they died, the sooner they died. So this dose response meant more sitting equals more death. Even more sitting equals sooner death, which is pretty crazy stuff. So more sitting equals earlier death, and that was even when they controlled for men versus women, age, smoking status, and body mass index. So whether you're overweight or thin, whether you're smoker or non-smoker, or whether you're a male or a female, still, sitting more increased your risk of death. And the more you sat, the sooner you died. So, again, these are the same recommendations that we talked about last week. Get up every 20 minutes if possible throughout the day. Even if you can just stand up and sit down once, or get up and go take a break, come back, you'll be more productive anyway. Don't watch TV for more than 2 hours a day, and even less is better. And don't sit for more than 6 hours a day. It's 6. Don't sit for more than 6 hours a day, and less sitting is better because that dose response works the other way too. The less we sit, the longer we'll live. The more we'll decrease our risk of dying early. So, if you have trouble standing, if you have trouble moving around, that's something that we can help you with. Sometimes people don't get up because they hurt. Sometimes people don't get up because they're lazy. The lazy, I can try to motivate you, but the pain, I can really help you with. That's what we do. We deal with pain and mobility problems to help you get up and move and be able to balance and move well. And so check us out. Here's a link, soundbalancept.com, and you can check us out for a stretch session at soundbalancept.com/stretch release or soundbalancept.com/massage to come in for a massage in case you're aching after all that movement or TV watching. So I will see you next week. Thanks for watching.